Hey guys, welcome to Relationship Stories with TaleTime. The first story is titled, Parents/Siblings Neglected Me Since Birth Because I Was an Accident. The story starts like this. I'm 28 years old now and I finally feel like I'm free from the toxic hell that was my family. I know this is going to be a long one, but my story is wild and I need to get it off my chest. My parents had my older brother, Thomas, when they were 20. 2 years later, my sister, Jessica, was born. They were young parents, but everyone said they were naturals. They doted on my siblings and showered them with love and attention. Pictures of their childhood are full of family vacations, holidays, and happy memories. Then came me. My mom always said I was a surprise, not the good kind. They had decided 2 kids were enough, and they were excited to focus on their careers and travel. Finding out they were pregnant again threw a wrench in their plans. From the moment I was born, things felt different. My arrival wasn't celebrated like my siblings. There are very few pictures of me as a baby, and even fewer with my parents. My mom went back to work almost immediately, and I was mostly raised by a series of nannies. As I grew older, the disparity between how my siblings and I were treated became glaringly obvious. Thomas and Jessica were given the best of everything: clothes, toys, extracurricular activities. They had their own rooms, decorated to their liking. I got hand-me-downs, often stained or ripped, and shared a room with a rotating cast of nannies. They even got brand new cars when they turned 16, while I was told to save up for a used one myself. My parents were always distant and preoccupied. They never came to my school plays or soccer games, always claiming they were too busy with work. When I did see them, it felt like they were just going through the motions. They never asked me about my day, my friends, or my dreams. It was like I was an inconvenience, a burden they had to bear. Their neglect went beyond material things. It was the constant emotional coldness that really hurt. I remember once, when I was around 8, I fell off my bike and scraped my knee pretty badly. I ran inside, crying, looking for comfort. My mom was on the phone, talking to a client. She glanced at me and said, "Go put some Neosporin on it, honey. Mommy's busy." Meanwhile, if Thomas or Jessica even sneezed, it was a 5-alarm fire. The emotional neglect was the worst part. I constantly craved their approval, their love, but it was never given freely. My siblings could do no wrong in their eyes. Thomas was the star athlete, and Jessica was the gifted artist. I was just there. I remember one Christmas, I was 10 years old. I had saved up my allowance for months to buy my mom a necklace I had seen at the mall. I was so excited to give it to her, hoping it would finally make her happy. But when I presented it to her, she barely glanced at it. "Oh, that's nice, honey," she said, tossing it aside and turning back to her conversation with Jessica. Jessica, on the other hand, had painted my mom a picture. It wasn't very good, all blobs of color and childish scribbles, but my mom acted like it was a masterpiece. She hung it up in the living room right above the fireplace, where it remained for years. My necklace ended up in a drawer somewhere, forgotten. That's how it always was. My efforts were never enough, never appreciated. My siblings were showered with praise for even the smallest achievements, while I was ignored or criticized. This constant neglect and emotional abuse took a toll on me. I became withdrawn and anxious. I struggled in school, unable to focus. I had a hard time making friends, always feeling like I was on the outside looking in. I started acting out, getting into trouble at school, just to get some kind of reaction from my parents. But even when I did something wrong, their response was always muted, almost indifferent. It was like they couldn't be bothered to even get angry with me. By the time I was a teenager, I was a mess. I felt worthless, unloved, and completely alone. I hated myself, hated my life, and hated my family for making me feel this way. I was a burden, a mistake, an accident, and they never let me forget it. Things came to a head when I was 15. I was going through a particularly rough patch, skipping school, getting into fights, and generally rebelling against everything and everyone. My grades plummeted, and I was on the verge of getting expelled. One night, after a particularly nasty argument with my dad, I stormed out of the house. I didn't have anywhere to go, so I ended up crashing at a friend's place. I figured my parents would come looking for me, try to smooth things over like they always did with Thomas and Jessica. But this time was different. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't hear a word from them. Finally, my friend's mom called my parents, worried about my well-being. My dad came to pick me up, but there was no hug, no "we were worried" sick, no attempt at reconciliation. He drove me home in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned to me and said, "This isn't working out. You're clearly not happy here. You're a disruption to this family, and we think it's best if you move out." I was stunned. "What are you talking about? Where am I supposed to go?" "You're 15, he said coldly. "You can figure it out. We've arranged for you to live with your Aunt Susan for a while. She's expecting you." Aunt Susan was my mom's older sister, a woman I barely knew. She lived in a small rundown apartment on the other side of town. I had met her maybe twice in my entire life. Before I could even protest, my dad had unloaded my meager belongings on the curb and driven away. I stood there, watching his car disappear down the street, feeling completely abandoned. Aunt Susan wasn't thrilled to have me. She was a single mom, struggling to raise 2 kids of her own. My presence just added another mouth to feed, another burden on her already strained resources. She wasn't cruel, but she wasn't exactly welcoming either. I slept on a cot in the living room, ate whatever was cheapest, and generally felt like an intruder in her home. Going to school was tough. I was exhausted from working nights at a local diner to help Aunt Susan with expenses. I was also incredibly lonely and depressed. My grades continued to suffer, and I was constantly on edge, afraid of making a mistake and ending up on the streets. But somehow, I managed to graduate high school. It wasn't pretty, but I did it. I knew I couldn't rely on my family for anything, so I worked even harder, taking on extra shifts, saving every penny I could. I enrolled in community college, taking night classes while working full-time during the day. It was grueling, but I was determined to make something of myself, to prove to my family and to myself that I wasn't a failure. I learned to be resourceful, to stretch a dollar, to navigate the world without a safety net. I learned the hard way about responsibility, accountability, and the importance of hard work. It wasn't easy, but I was surviving. More than that, I was thriving. I was building a life for myself, a life that was completely separate from the toxic environment I had escaped. Every day, I woke up with a fire in my belly, a drive to succeed that was fueled by years of neglect and rejection. I was determined to prove them wrong, to show them that I was more than just an accident, a burden, a mistake. I was going to make something of myself, no matter what. Community college was a turning point for me. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, heard, and valued. My professors recognized my potential, encouraging me to push myself further. I excelled in my classes, discovering a passion for computer science. I transferred to a 4-year university, working my way through with scholarships and part-time jobs. The workload was intense, but I thrived on the challenge. I loved the feeling of expanding my knowledge, mastering new skills, and proving to myself that I was capable of achieving anything I set my mind to. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were times when I felt overwhelmed, exhausted, and ready to give up. But then I would remember where I came from, the years of neglect and rejection, and that would fuel my determination even further. I graduated with honors, landing a coveted software engineering job at a tech startup. The work was challenging and rewarding, and I quickly climbed the ranks, becoming a lead developer within a few years. My career took off. I was making more money than I ever thought possible, enough to finally move out of Aunt Susan's cramped apartment and get my own place. It wasn't a fancy condo or anything, but it was mine. My own space, my own rules, my own life. I furnished it with care, choosing each piece of furniture and decoration to reflect my personality and my journey. It was a far cry from the sterile, impersonal bedrooms I had as a child, rooms that never felt like mine. I started traveling, exploring new places, and experiencing new cultures. I had always dreamed of seeing the world, but my family had never encouraged or supported my wanderlust. Now I was finally free to explore, to discover, to experience life on my own terms. I also invested in myself, taking classes in everything from photography to cooking to martial arts. I wanted to learn, to grow, to become a well-rounded individual, something my family had never valued. My life was a stark contrast to the one I had left behind. I was surrounded by supportive friends, colleagues who respected me, and a partner who loved me for who I was. My family, on the other hand, remained stuck in their toxic patterns. Thomas had peaked in high school, never quite living up to his star athlete potential. He bounced from job to job, always blaming others for his failures. Jessica, the gifted artist, had become a self-absorbed, entitled princess, constantly demanding attention and validation. My parents continued to enable their behavior, blind to their flaws and shortcomings. They still lived in their bubble of privilege and denial, oblivious to the pain they had inflicted on me. I had tried to reach out a few times, hoping to build some kind of relationship with them, but their response was always the same: disinterest, judgment, and a complete lack of understanding. They couldn't see past their own preconceived notions of who I was supposed to be, the accident they never wanted. So I made the difficult but necessary decision to cut off contact. I blocked their numbers, unfriended them on social media, and built a wall between us. It was painful at first, but it was also liberating. I was finally free from their negativity, their judgment, their constant reminders of the past. I was free to be myself, to embrace my own identity, to define my own success. I was no longer the unwanted child, the burden, the mistake. I was a successful, independent, and fulfilled adult, living a life that was beyond anything they could have imagined. And I had done it all on my own. For years, I maintained a strict no-contact policy with my family. I built a fulfilling life, filled with love, success, and genuine connection. But the wounds of my past still lingered, a dull ache that resurfaced every now and then. The catalyst for my scorched earth revenge came unexpectedly. My partner and I were planning our wedding, excited to celebrate our love with close friends and family. We decided to invite my Aunt Susan, the one person who had shown me some kindness during those difficult teenage years. Aunt Susan was overjoyed about the wedding, but she also dropped a bombshell. My parents, she revealed, were facing financial ruin. My father's business had gone bankrupt, and they were on the verge of losing their home, the very home where I had felt so unwanted and neglected. My initial reaction was a mixture of disbelief and, honestly, satisfaction. Karma, it seemed, had finally caught up with them. But as the news sank in, a different emotion took hold. Anger. For years they had lived a life of privilege, squandering money on my siblings while I struggled to survive. Now, they were facing the consequences of their actions, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of righteous indignation. That's when the idea for revenge took root. I wouldn't just stand by and watch them lose everything. I would orchestrate their downfall, ensuring they experienced the same level of abandonment and despair they had inflicted on me. My plan was simple, yet devastating. I knew my parents had always relied on their image, their social standing. They were active members of the local country club, hosting lavish parties and flaunting their wealth. That's where I would strike. I contacted the country club's board members, anonymously leaking information about my father's bankruptcy and impending financial ruin. I detailed his shady business dealings, his unpaid debts, and his history of exploiting others for personal gain. The news spread like wildfire. My parents were ostracized from the community, their reputation tarnished beyond repair. Their friends abandoned them, their social invitations dried up, and their carefully crafted facade of success crumbled before their eyes. To add insult to injury, I anonymously purchased their foreclosed home, ensuring they wouldn't receive any proceeds from the sale. They were forced to move into a small, run-down apartment, a stark contrast to the luxurious life they had once enjoyed. The fallout was swift and brutal. My father, stripped of his pride and status, spiraled into depression. My mother, accustomed to a life of comfort and luxury, became bitter and resentful. My siblings, coddled and entitled, were ill-equipped to handle the harsh realities of their new situation. Their reactions ranged from anger and denial to despair and self-pity. They blamed each other, they blamed the world, but they never once considered that their own actions had led to their downfall. As for me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, knowing I had exacted my revenge. But there was also a tinge of sadness, realizing the extent of their dysfunction and the depth of their denial. My revenge hadn't brought me closure or healing. It had simply exposed the ugliness of my family's dynamics, confirming the toxic patterns I had escaped years ago. In the end, my scorched earth revenge was a Pyrrhic victory. It had inflicted pain and suffering, but it hadn't erased the past or healed the wounds. Today, I continue to live my life on my own terms, focused on building a future filled with love, purpose, and genuine connection. I've learned that true strength lies not in revenge but in forgiveness, letting go of the past, and embracing the present. My story is a reminder that family isn't always about blood ties. It's about the people who choose to love and support you, the ones who see your worth, and the ones who help you become the best version of yourself. Update: it's been 4 years since my family's world came crashing down. I haven't spoken to them since. I moved on with my life, focusing on my career and my relationship with my partner. We got married, bought a house, and even adopted a rescue dog. Life was good, peaceful. Then, out of the blue, I got a call. It was my brother, Thomas. He sounded desperate. He told me my dad had a stroke and was in the hospital. He asked me to come see him. I hesitated. Part of me wanted nothing to do with him. But another part, a small, quiet part, felt a tug of something. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was a sense of duty. I couldn't explain it. I decided to go. I didn't tell my partner. I didn't want to burden them with my messy past. The hospital room was sterile and cold. My dad looked frail, a shadow of his former self. He was hooked up to machines, his face slack, his breathing labored. My mom sat beside him, her face etched with worry and exhaustion. Thomas was there too, looking lost and unsure. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. My mom looked up as I entered. Her eyes widened in surprise, then filled with tears. She reached out for me, her voice trembling. "Oh, sweetheart, you came." I didn't hug her back. I couldn't. Too much had happened. "How is he?" I asked, my voice flat. "Not good," Thomas mumbled. "The doctors say he might not make it." We sat there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words and years of accumulated hurt. My mom started talking, her voice cracking. She apologized for how they had treated me. She admitted they had made mistakes, that they had been blinded by their own priorities and failed to see the pain they had caused. "We were wrong," she said, her eyes pleading. "We took you for granted. We didn't appreciate you. Can you ever forgive us?" I didn't know what to say. Their apology, while unexpected, didn't erase the years of neglect and emotional abuse. It didn't magically heal the wounds of my past. But seeing them now, broken and vulnerable, something shifted inside me. The anger, the resentment, the thirst for revenge. It all seemed to fade away, replaced by a weary sense of acceptance. I didn't forgive them, not fully, but I realized that holding on to the anger was only hurting me. They were already facing the consequences of their actions, living a life stripped of the privilege and status they had once cherished. My dad passed away a few days later. I attended the funeral, standing silently beside my mom and siblings. There were no grand pronouncements of grief, no dramatic displays of sorrow. It was a quiet, somber affair, a reflection of the fractured family we had become. After the funeral, I had a brief conversation with my mom and siblings. There were no apologies, no recriminations. We simply acknowledged each other's presence, a tacit understanding that the past was the past. I didn't suddenly become best friends with my family. We didn't have some miraculous reconciliation, but we reached a point of peaceful coexistence, a recognition of our shared history, however flawed and painful it might be. I left that day knowing I wouldn't be a part of their lives, not in any meaningful way. But I also left with a sense of closure, a feeling that the cycle of hurt and resentment had finally been broken. I returned to my life, my chosen family, the people who truly loved and valued me. I carried with me the scars of my past, but I also carried the strength and resilience I had gained from overcoming adversity. My story wasn't a fairy tale, but it was mine. And in the end, that was enough. Here are my thoughts about the story. Wow, OP, just wow? I read your whole story, all 4 parts, and I'm honestly speechless. I felt so many emotions reading it: anger at your parents, sadness for you, and then this weird mix of satisfaction and unease when you got your revenge. It's crazy how parents can be so different with their kids. Like, I get that people make mistakes, but the way they treated you compared to your siblings is just messed up. It's like they forgot you were their kid too. Your story reminded me of a friend of mine, Sarah. Her parents weren't as blatantly awful as yours, but they definitely had their favorites. Sarah's older sister was like the golden child, always praised, always getting her way. Sarah was kind of invisible. She was a good kid, smart and funny, but her parents just didn't seem to notice her much. It messed her up, you know. She always felt like she had to prove herself, like she wasn't good enough. She ended up getting into some bad relationships, always trying to please people who didn't care about her. It took her a long time, but she finally realized she deserved better. She cut ties with those toxic people, started focusing on herself, and now she's doing great. She's got a good job, a loving partner, and she's finally happy. Reading your story, especially the part about your revenge, made me think about what I would do in that situation. Honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to say I'd be above it, that I wouldn't stoop to their level. But then I think about the years of hurt and anger you carried, and I can understand why you did what you did. It's like, sometimes people need to see the consequences of their actions, even if it's brutal. It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it maybe helps them understand the pain they caused. I'm glad you found some peace in the end, even if it wasn't a perfect happy ending. It sounds like you built a good life for yourself, surrounded by people who actually care about you. That's what matters. Your story is a good reminder that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who choose to love and support you, the ones who are there for you no matter what. Here is an interesting comment from a reader about the story. Reading Op's story felt like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart. It wasn't just the blatant neglect and emotional abuse, it was that aching familiarity of being the overlooked, undervalued child. It brought back a flood of memories, each one a paper cut on my soul. My dad wasn't a monster like Op's parents. He never threw me out or actively tried to sabotage my life. But he had his favorites, and I was decidedly not one of them. My older brother, Mark, was his pride and joy. Mark was the charismatic one, the athlete, the life of the party. He could charm his way out of any situation, and my dad ate it up. Me? I was the quiet one, the bookworm, the kid who preferred spending hours lost in a fantasy world than playing ball. I wasn't a troublemaker, I got good grades, but it never seemed to be enough. In my dad's eyes, I was always in Mark's shadow, a pale imitation of the son he truly adored. I remember once, I was maybe 10 or 11, I had spent weeks building a model airplane for a school project. I painstakingly glued each tiny piece together, meticulously painted it, and even added little details like the pilot and the cockpit instruments. I was so proud of it. When I showed it to my dad, expecting some praise, some acknowledgement of my effort, he barely glanced at it. "That's nice, son," he mumbled, his eyes already drifting back to the TV where Mark was scoring a winning goal in some football game. That moment, that casual dismissal, felt like a punch to the gut. It was a small thing, but it spoke volumes about my place in the family hierarchy. I was the backup player, the understudy, never quite good enough to take center stage. Things got exponentially worse after my mom died. She was the glue that held our family together, the one who saw me, who understood me. After she was gone, my dad retreated further into himself, leaning heavily on Mark for support and companionship. I was just there, a ghost haunting the periphery of their grief, unseen and unheard. My dad never really asked how I was coping, never seemed to notice the gaping hole in my life. He was too consumed by his own pain, too reliant on Mark to fill the void left by my mom. I tried, for years, to get my dad's attention, to earn his approval. I excelled in school, got a good job, tried to be the perfect son, but it was never enough. He was stuck in his patterns, blinded by his favoritism, unable to see the person I was, the person I was trying to become. It took a long time, a lot of therapy and soul-searching, but I finally realized I couldn't keep chasing his validation. I was never going to be the son he wanted, the son he valued, and that was okay. His inability to see my worth was his failing, not mine. I moved out, created a life that brought me joy and fulfillment. I surrounded myself with people who loved and appreciated me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. Eventually, I stopped trying to have a relationship with my dad. It was too painful, too fraught with unspoken expectations and unmet needs. We'd exchange the occasional phone call, the obligatory holiday greetings, but there was no real connection, no genuine affection. It's sad, I won't deny that, but it's also liberating. Letting go of the hope, the yearning for a father's love that was never meant to be, freed me to embrace the love that was already present in my life. And guys, with this we have reached the end of the video. If you enjoy my content, please like the video, comment with some clock emojis to show your support, and subscribe if you have not done so already. Thanks a lot, and I will see you again tomorrow.